Well, hello there. So today I'll be talking about the current state of Linux and all of that stuff. So where is this whole Linux situation going? And I'll begin by discussing more practical aspects, things that might affect the user directly, and what the experience is like. So now if you're new or if you are considering moving to Linux, this first part is going to be the one you're going to be interested in. So I'll begin by discussing software and software reliability. So you might have heard that there isn't a lot of software being supported on Linux, but this is complete nonsense. There are huge amounts of software. So now, if you want Discord, there is um, there is Discord. If you want Slack, there is Slack as well. If you want Steam, there is Steam. You know, loads of big software does exist, and there are options. Things like Slack exists too, and basically, a lot of the software does exist on Linux as well. However, not everything does exist. For example, Adobe Software Suite, that doesn't. And it probably isn't going to. I can't imagine it doing, given how it is. Adobe doesn't seem to want to make it available, and frankly, I don't see why they would ever want to. It doesn't seem like Adobe is the kind of company that would do it. So if you're like using these Windows specific piece of software and you're stuck to them, then well, you might not be able to get the Linux. So I would look up if there is a Linux version of whatever you're making or whatever you're intending on using. If you're really need to do that, but also look into alternatives. So for example, if I want to do something like Photoshop, there's GIMP. It looks very different, so you will need to actually learn a different workflow. Or you will have to customize it to look like whatever you're used to, and it will still be different. But there are tools to actually do things. You know, if you want to do vector graphics, there's Inkscape. Once again, different, but it does work. It's a very feature-rich piece of software. It's very shareable once you know how to use it. You know, if you want to do drawing, there's Krita. And it's very shareable as well. You know, basically, there's lots of tools you can use to do your different things. You just have to familiarize yourself with the different workflows, and that's really where it's going to be. Are you willing to learn to use alternatives, or are you going to want to stick to what you already know? Because if you only know like Photoshop, and if you have like spent 30 years using that, and you don't want to learn a new thing, then well, Gib might not be so great because it's going to need learning again, and you might lose what you have already learned, and that's not really nice, of course. So consider that. On the other hand, if you are not really experienced with anything in particular, or you have used a GIMP before, then that's not going to really be a problem. You know, you'll be fine. And if you're open to learning the new workflow, if you're open to, yeah, I want to learn this, I'm ready to learn this new app if I need to, then it's great. So really, the conclusion I draw about the whole software situation is that if you are willing to learn a new workflow, or if you're used to these Linux apps already, or if you know are not really preset with any particular workflows as it is, then you won't have a problem with the Linux software. And a lot of software does exist. Discord does exist, Krita does exist, Slack does exist, Steam does exist. So, just do your research on what exists and what alternatives there exist for what you're using. As far as hardware support goes, which is my second topic, it has gotten further, Now you can get pretty much any hardware to work, except for like a new, like if you want for like a new M1 Max, Wi-Fi won't work. There aren't many distros available. All the other hardware won't work. So like new Macs are not going to work well, for example. But like most Windows computers will work fine. All the Macs will work fine. So on. So yeah. However, it is still not up to par on Windows. So, for instance, you might need to install third-party drivers. You might have some issues with those third-party drivers, and this Linux will not have everything inbuilt. So, if you want to use like a proprietary Wi-Fi card, then you need to find those proprietary drivers for it. And to do so, it can be complicated. Unlike Ubuntu, it's going to be very easy. All you have to do is click like two buttons. but on some other distros it might be more difficult. Graphics-wise, once again, it's going to be fairly easy. You just, especially for AMD, if you're AMD, then it's just going to be kernel, but if you are using NVIDIA, then you will need to get NVIDIA drivers. So in this case, you might want to use something like FOSS, which are the S9 SO, and FOSS because they like have the SO that has the NVIDIA drivers built in. So you can just use that. Otherwise, you have to use it manually. But once again, on something like Ubuntu, it's 2 clicks in one app, so not exactly difficult. So yeah, if you have like hardware that is proprietary, I would recommend using like Ubuntu or PopOS because you can really easily enable drivers for them. Otherwise, you're going to have to do it more manually. Also, Manjaro has the option to do it through an app, although it's a bit more difficult than Ubuntu. So yeah, but the use mount is easy to use on distros, and getting those drivers are not going to be a problem. So do not be worried. You have to go into an app and click 2 buttons for it, but it's not going to be more difficult than that usually. But some hardware won't really work, and you know, once again, those new Macs not going to be so good experience. Now, gaming is the third topic, and as far as this goes, it has really gotten far. So we have Steam, and that's also correctly spelled. And in Steam, if I open it up, there are options that you play on Linux, so you only have something called Proton, and Proton means you can play Windows games on Linux. So once it launches up, I can show you what it actually does and how it works. So it's messing with the accounts now, but now it's actually, so I don't want to update things. My god. Stop doing your cache content. But yeah, let's say I want to play a Linux only game, or a Windows only game, sorry. So let's take Gate Dangers for example. You can go into app settings, your good properties, you can go to compatibility, and you can force the use of a Proton. And this is like a wine version that allows you to run Windows games on Linux. And then, you know, if you want to go to settings, you can go into here into Steam Play, and you can select your default Proton version for any titles. This means you can actually play Windows games on Linux. However, you cannot play any cheat games. So if you have something that has like a kernel anti-cheat, if you have, for example, Valorant, or if you have Rainbow Six, or something like that, it's not going to run. Because kernel anti-cheats are not going to run. However, Valve has announced something called the Steam Deck, which is a handheld gaming console. It runs upon Linux, and they have promised to provide 100% support for Steam games. That means if they do what they promise to do, they are going to be able to provide you with support for anti-cheats. Those anti-cheats are going to run on Linux, assuming Steam can actually, or Valve can actually do what they promise to do. So we don't know yet how this is going to go, but it's a very good sign. And we can expect advancements in anti-cheats, and maybe these anti-cheat games will become playable soon when the Steam Deck launches. So, you know, if you're interested in gaming, keep track of that, you know, flow that up, because it might become the case that you can actually play anti-cheats soon. But anything that doesn't have anti-cheat will mostly run fine. So the anti-cheat is the redone problem, and if you're wondering about non-Steam games, there's something called Lutris, so you know, you can install games with this very easily. Just go to the website and click a button, and then you can, you know, for example, launch Epic Game Store through Lutris. So you can launch Epic Game Store this way, and it will work, and games will launch too. And now I messed up the, here we go. But yeah, you can see it will launch the Epic Game Store fine, so you can actually run these things. You can run, you know, non-Steam games too through Lutris, so you don't need to worry. So in other words, gaming has gotten very far. Anything that isn't, we doesn't have a kernel anti-cheat, is going to run fine. Generally, there are exceptions. Some individual games might have problems, but nearly anything will run if it doesn't have an anti-cheat. However, that anti-cheat situation is also probably going ahead, with Valve, you know, implementing support for Team Proton through Steam Deck. it's going to be very likely that the rest of Linux as well is going to be able to use that anti-cheat game. So, keep track of this. It might actually be that Linux catch up completely, depending on how well Valve is able to do with the anti-cheat Proton support. So, keep track of that and keep following that up, because it might really be a really good thing. If you don't play anti-cheat games, or if you're willing to give anti-cheat games up, then Linux is great, and you can go here without problems. Now here's my fourth topic for the first part, which is going to be the ease of use. So back in the day, it used to be the case that Linux was considered to be hard to use, to be very, hard to install, blah, blah, blah. But it's not like this anymore. You can install, for example, Ubuntu or Manjaro or whatever, and you have a graphical installer. You have to click on a few buttons, which are very self-explanatory, very clear, and you have it installed in 10 minutes. It's much easier than Windows install process, so, it's really not going to be hard. The user experience is going to depend, so here's where you might want to consider some things. So, for example, if you are used to Windows UI, something like GNOME, which can install Ubuntu, is going to be very different from the Windows UI. You might have difficulties getting used to it, and so on. Although it's very simple. But there are other options. You can get something like Cinnamon, for example, which you can get with Linux Mint. And there's something like KDE, which has default configuration that looks a bit like Windows. Then there's other options like XFCE, which might look a bit like macOS, and Deepin, which once again might look a bit like macOS, and so on. So, you can look into these different options. Linux Mint is a good one. If you want something that looks like Windows, then Linux Mint is a great option. It's basically Ubuntu with some desktop and some other changes. So if you want something that appears familiar, then use Linux Mint. It's still going to be different, but it's going to be somewhat similar to Windows. So it's going to be, and people, have been saying in the past that yeah, it's all command line stuff. No longer. You can do almost everything in UI. You can use a graphical installer to install apps. It's simple as clicking a single button on an app page. You can find everything in that one package manager graphical interface thing. So one single graphical app, you can find all of your apps. You can click install, one button, and it will install. Then you can, do everything else, settings, graphical applications, exit for list of environments, if you want the text files, apps for it, you want to add your files, apps for it. There's apps for everything, so no need to use the command line as a new user, so don't worry about it. It's really a thing of the past, and of course you can use the command line, it's very powerful, but you don't have to use it. So, it's a lot easier than it used to be, much simpler, much quicker, not really anything else. So yeah, that's really all it is. So that's the first part covered. The current state of things is very well. There are some issues. Hardware support isn't quite as far as Windows is. And, anti-cheat games aren't here yet, although they might be coming, or they might not. Just follow and keep track of what Steam Deck does and keep track of what Proton is capable of doing. If they do pull it off, then great. That would be amazing. And it's much easier to use. It's going to be different, but it's going to be easy to use as long as you're willing to learn it. Just be open to some differences in how things work, because obviously it's going to be different. Now let's move on to the second part of the video and discuss some of the less practical things. So I'll begin with kernel size. So one thing I've heard a lot through my time in using is that the kernel is getting big, it's bloated, so on. And in some ways it is, there's a lot of code being contributed, and it's getting bigger, and it's getting quite big, and of course it's going to be hard to maintain. There's getting more potential for exploits, for vulnerabilities, for issues. But at the same time, I think people make a big deal out of this when it doesn't need to be. The reason it's so big is because of hardware support. They need to support new hardware. And Sure, you can argue for smaller kernel, but if that smaller kernel you can't run on your hardware, then it's not going to be a good thing. If you can't run your operating system, then is a smaller kernel size really going to be a benefit to you? That's something I want to think. Yes, it's getting big and it's getting a bit more bloated. I see the appeal in something like FreeBSD, but at the same time, if you can't run hardware on it, it's not going to go well. Linux is pushing to be more user friendly, to be able to be able to run for desktop market. And if you're going to say, yeah, kernel is too big and make it smaller, what that's going to mean, it's going to become what it was 10 years ago. People aren't going to be able to run their software. There's not going to be features, People aren't going to be able to run it on their computers because the hardware support has been removed and drivers have been removed and, so on. So, that's not really that big of an issue because the reason it's getting bigger is to allow for people to use the kernel. It's because we're making it more user-friendly, we're making it better for the users. And by saying, if this is a problem, then that's just more of an elitist thing, it's about, yeah, keep the smaller kernel, but keep everybody else out from our kernel, There are forks of the Linux kernel that are, more optimized, and you can always compile your own kernel, if you want something smaller on your hardware. Of course, still, the maintaining is going to be an issue, but there's a reason why it's bigger. It's getting bigger for a reason, and there's people that are working on it, and of course it's going to be bigger. If there's more people working on it, if there's more features being implemented, and if there's going to be, more hardware that's going to be supported, of course it's going to get bigger, that's obvious. So the complaint is kind of dumb. And also, old code is being removed. There's old stuff I see where, like, as somebody who has compiled my kernel multiple times, I see there's features being removed. So, it's not all just being added, there's also removed code. Of course, there's more code to remove, but still. There is a reason why the code is added. I don't like this complaint, it's kind of nonsense. More code is added for a good reason. It's not, I don't think it's a valid complaint to say, yeah, it's getting bigger, so it's bad. It's getting bigger for a reason, and it's going to benefit us that there's more users that are using Linux. So all this increased kernel size is going to mean is it's going to mean Linux better to use, and there's more people who are going to be able to use Linux because it's becoming easier to use, which I mentioned before. So now moving on to Audacity, and with the whole interaction of telemetry and where software for Linux is going to go, where FOSS software is going to go. So basically, the story behind this is that Audacity, which is like a really big free and open source audio editor software, has started to introduce some telemetry. They have started to introduce a privacy policy which allows them to take data from the users. And there's some very concerning bits in it. Now, there's things like them collecting your IP, your hardware info, things like that. Now, some of it is opt-in, some of it isn't opt-in, some of it is opt-out, which is not good. And it's a bit janky overall. Because an audio app shouldn't need any of this. It shouldn't need to connect servers, it shouldn't need to collect your data at all. Anything. Yeah, it does. So I don't like where it's going, and there's even more concerning part in it. They basically say something like, they can ask about any data for law enforcement reasons, and basically what this means is they can take anything whatsoever, as long as for law enforcement reasons. And that's not good. Your audio editing app shouldn't be able to take whatever the hell data they want because of whatever law, whatever. This is not something that belongs in an audio editing app. It doesn't belong there. It doesn't, and it's free and open source too. And it doesn't belong there. It shouldn't be there. There's no reason for it to be there. There's no purpose whatsoever for the app. You're just taking data at this point, and that's really not. That's not good, and it's not what the situation is, and this is what's drawing a lot of concern, Like the fact they're like taking this data, it's not something that belongs there, and people are, make ass of it. It's making things seem bad, and why not? And of course, there's other things to deal with it, but this is the main problem, with the fault tracking. But another thing is that they added, an age restriction. They are saying if you're not under 13, you cannot use the app. And this is like really, really dumb because the app is licensed under something called GPL, and that's a free and open source license. And what this 13 plus restriction does, it violates GPL. It violates the license because GPL states you can't restrict who uses your app. And if you're restricting who you can use your app, then you're basically just breaking that license altogether. And they are doing that. They're licensing under a certain license, and they are breaking that license now. And that's not good. It's not what you should be doing. So, like, the whole licensing too is complete cluster mess. It's a complete clusterfuck as far as the actual licensing goes now, because they have decided to break the license rules, and that's not good. So yeah, does this mean the entire Linux market is screwed? Does this mean the entire free and open source community is going to screw and everything is going to have telemetry? No, it doesn't. It only means auditors are going to have this. There are already forks being made without the telemetry, and there's alternatives. So if you don't want telemetry, you can use forks, those sort of thing. And you're going to be able to avoid telemetry. You can make your own fork too. It's very easy to make one as well. So, yeah, it's not a complex issue. You can make your own forks of Audacity and have your own non-telemetry app. And you can run it in like Firechail, and you can, in many other ways, isolate it and work things the way you want. So, no need to worry, no need to feel awful about that. It's not going to imply anything for the Linux market, really. I mean, if somebody else does it, same thing. There's going to be forks, there's going to be alternatives, there's going to be people are just going to use it. So, it's... If you don't like something, then just don't use it. It's a very simple matter. It's not really that major an issue in the large scale. It's still awful and it sucks. Like, Odyssey shouldn't be doing this. It's a really disappointing thing to see. But it doesn't, I don't think it means anything in the larger picture so far. And as far as the open source community goes, there's some issues with it, For instance, the Open Source Foundation or whatever it's called, that's completely screwed up now. Apparently there's, people being kicked out, and it's being taken over by people who want proprietary stuff, and who want to remove FOSS and get rid of it, basically, and that's not good. And there's some apparent, actions taken against, founders of, the Free Software Foundation, and things like that, have been taken and are being taken, and that can be considered sketchy. On the other hand, the reason why this stuff is being done is for a reason. I mean, for example, Linus Torvalds, who is the original inventor of Linux, has had some backlash, and it is something that could make it very negative. But we need to consider who this person is. This is the guy who said, fuck NVIDIA, openly, in public. This guy doesn't mind insulting people. He's very rough with his language, generally. He's, he doesn't have a lot of what would generally be considered professionalism. So, just because he's the original developer of something doesn't mean he's exempt from, facing consequences. It doesn't mean he's a god or a perfection. It doesn't. He has made mistakes, has done things wrong, and he's facing backlash for those things. That's not bad for Linux. Linux is open source, somebody else can take it up, and somebody else can keep developing it. Just because these people are, facing this backlash doesn't mean it's, doesn't mean it's, a bad thing. It doesn't mean Linux is dying or it doesn't mean it's bad for Linux. It just means there's people doing sketchy shit and they're getting consequences for it. And Nostalon 2, for example, was kicked from Free Software Foundation in the past. And yeah, that's a bit chunky, but he's back there now, so who cares? And once again, he was kicked for something chunky said. So once again, it's really not something that we should be too critical about. The only thing we should really be critical about is with the whole takeover of the open source foundation or whatever it is, that stuff, where there's actual like things being done against open source, that's where we need to like that's what we need to avoid really. But as far as the actual situation with like Stallman and Linus, we need to like consider like the actual we need to consider the actual situation with the why it happened, because there's a reason why all this happened, and it's not just abrupt nonsense, think about why it happened, and so on. So don't assume everything just by the appearance, basically. Of course, there's still some chunk going on. I mean, it can be a bit chunky, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with his approaches of, kicking people out for like saying one thing, or, forcing like people to take vacations from what they're doing. I don't necessarily think this is correct approach. So now there could be a reflection on what is being done, but it's not a huge deal. It's not like a deal breaker. It's, there's a reason why these things are being done, basically. And we want to acknowledge that. So, yeah. That concludes this video. That concludes everything. If you have any additional points to make, anything you disagree with me with, anything I agree with, feel free to point out, feel free to comment it, and see you around in the next thing.